A billionaire CEO mocked the black daughter of a janitor in front of a room full of elites. But minutes later, she uncovered a flaw that could bring his entire empire down. Like and subscribe, then tell me if you had spoken up in her place. The glass walls of Helixara Technologies reflected the gray New York sky with cold precision. Outside one of its most restricted conference rooms stood 19-year-old Zaria Cole, fingers curled around the strap of her worn backpack, quiet but not uncertain. The hallway buzzed with urgency. Executives brushed past without eye contact, voices low and sharp, while a crisis worth billions unfolded behind the double doors. "Mom, you can't be here." The voice was firm, practiced, the kind that didn't expect resistance. And Zaria turned her head slightly to face the security guard approaching her. His expression, not hostile, but dismissive, in a way that had nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with who he thought she was, or more precisely, who she wasn't. "This floor is restricted," he continued, gesturing subtly toward the badge scanner mounted beside the door. "Employees only." Zaria didn't argue. She didn't explain that her mother had worked in this building for 15 years, that she had spent entire childhood afternoons sitting quietly in break rooms while Denise Cole finished late-night shifts, that she had grown up watching the glow of computer screens through glass walls just like these, absorbing more than anyone ever noticed. Instead, she simply nodded once and stepped back, but her eyes didn't leave the door. Another guard joined, less patient this time, his gaze flicking briefly over her clothes, her backpack, her skin, and settling into a conclusion he didn't bother to hide. "Do you have a badge?" he asked. Zaria shook her head. "Then you need to leave this area." There was no anger in his voice, only certainty, the kind that came from a system that had already made up its mind. As if to reinforce that certainty, the facial recognition scanner above the door activated, a soft mechanical hum followed by a sweeping beam of light that passed over Zaria's face, pausing for a fraction of a second before emitting a quiet, almost apologetic tone. "Access denied." The small screen displayed the message without hesitation, as if it had evaluated her presence and found it unworthy of entry. One of the guards gave a faint, knowing exhale, as though the machine had simply confirmed what he already believed. "See," he said, "system doesn't recognize you." Zaria's gaze shifted to the scanner, her expression unreadable. But something subtle changed in her eyes. Not anger, not embarrassment, but recognition, the kind that comes when a pattern reveals itself in plain sight. Inside the conference room, voices rose suddenly, sharp and overlapping, a spike in the tension that rippled through the hallway like a distant tremor. And for a brief moment, even the guards glanced toward the door, distracted by whatever crisis was unfolding beyond it. Zaria didn't move. She stood still, listening, her mind quietly assembling fragments of sound, tone, urgency, as if she were piecing together a puzzle no one had invited her to solve. The scanner above the door flickered again, running its silent calculations, its algorithms trained on millions of faces, millions of data points, and yet, somehow, it had failed to see the one person standing right in front of it. Why? The question lingered, unspoken but heavy, not just in the machine but in the space itself, in the assumptions embedded within systems built by people who rarely question what they couldn't see. Zaria tilted her head ever so slightly, her lips pressing together in a faint line that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite anything at all. And in that moment, she looked less like someone being turned away, and more like someone who had just discovered the first crack in something much larger than a locked door. Behind that door, a billion-dollar AI system was failing, collapsing under errors no one could fix, and outside it stood a girl the system couldn't even recognize, as if the two problems were unrelated, as if the blindness of one had nothing to do with the other. But Zaria knew better, even if she couldn't yet explain why, and as the guards turned their attention back to her, ready to escort her away, she took one last look at the scanner, her eyes steady, thoughtful, almost curious, as though she were asking a question the machine could never answer, a question that would soon unravel everything they believed about intelligence, authority, and who truly belonged inside that room. Inside the sealed conference room, more than 60 engineers faced a curved wall of screens flashing red alerts and unstable error logs, while Richard Halvorson stood at the center, rigid and visibly strained. "Run it again," he said, his voice low but edged with urgency, and a lead engineer obeyed immediately, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard as the system reinitialized for what must have been the 10th time that hour. But the result was the same. A brief moment of silence, followed by another burst of red warnings, another failure, another confirmation that whatever was wrong with Helixara's autonomous driving AI was not something they could fix with the tools they had been using. On one of the larger screens, footage from a test vehicle replayed in a loop, showing a car approaching an intersection, hesitating for a fraction of a second, and then accelerating at the wrong moment, the kind of mistake that should have been impossible in a system trained on millions of scenarios. And yet it had happened, not once but 4 times in the past 72 hours, each incident escalating the pressure, each one eroding the company's credibility in real time. "We've isolated the decision-making layer," another engineer said, his voice tight, "but the outputs don't match the inputs. It's like the system is misinterpreting its own instructions." Richard's jaw tightened as he stepped closer to the screen, studying the data as if sheer focus could force it into submission. But the numbers did not bend, and neither did the reality they represented. "This system was supposed to eliminate human error," he said, more to the room than to any one person, and the words carried a weight that made several engineers avoid eye contact, because they all understood what was at stake, not just the technology, but the promise it had been built on. At the far end of the table, a large video call window displayed a group of executives from one of Helixara's biggest automotive partners, their faces composed but increasingly distant, their questions more pointed with each passing minute. "We need reassurance," one of them said, his tone measured but firm, "because right now, what we're seeing is instability, and instability is not something we can attach our brand to." Another voice joined in, speaking more quietly, but with equal impact. "Our board is already discussing alternative partnerships." The implication settled heavily over the room because everyone knew what it meant, not just a delay or a renegotiation, but the beginning of a withdrawal that could ripple outward, taking other partners with it, accelerating a collapse that had already begun in the market. On a smaller screen in the corner, a financial ticker updated in real time, the numbers sliding downward in a steady, almost clinical descent that translated into billions lost, approximately $3.2 billion in value gone in just a few days, a figure that would have been unthinkable only a week ago. "We need a solution," Richard said, his voice sharper now, cutting through the overlapping conversations. "Not theories, not guesses, a solution." His words snapped the room back into motion, engineers returning to their terminals with renewed urgency. But beneath that urgency was something else, something quieter and more dangerous. The creeping realization that they might not have the answer, that despite their credentials, their experience, their access to the most advanced tools in the industry, they were facing a problem that refused to behave the way it was supposed to. One engineer leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes briefly before forcing himself upright again, while another stared at a single line of code as if willing it to reveal its secret. But the system remained stubbornly opaque. Its failure not dramatic but persistent, subtle enough to evade easy detection, severe enough to cause real-world consequences. Outside the room, just beyond the door that remained firmly closed, the hallway had grown quieter, the earlier movement replaced by a kind of waiting, as if the entire building were holding its breath, unaware that the answer to the crisis might already be standing just a few steps away, unnoticed, unrecognized, and uninvited. While inside, the system failed again, and this time the silence that followed lingered just a little longer, stretching into something that felt dangerously close to doubt. The silence inside the conference room had just begun to stretch into something fragile when the door suddenly opened from the inside after an assistant stepped out to call for maintenance, and all eyes shifted instinctively toward the interruption. In that brief opening, Denise Cole appeared at the threshold with her cleaning cart, visibly nervous, while Zaria stood just behind her, no longer hidden in the hallway. "I'm sorry," Denise began quickly, her voice respectful, almost apologetic. "We were just finishing up but she stopped when she realized the room had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that comes when attention sharpens rather than softens, when people are not simply looking, but assessing, measuring, deciding. Richard Halverson turned slowly from the main display, his gaze moving past Denise and settling on Zaria. And for a brief second, something unreadable passed through his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, as if he were trying to place her within a system that did not account for her being there. Then, almost casually, he let out a small, dry laugh that carried farther than it should have in the quiet room. "Well," he said, his tone light but edged with something sharper beneath it, "this is new." A few of the engineers shifted in their seats, some exchanging glances, others looking back at their screens as if to distance themselves from what was about to unfold. But the cameras mounted along the walls did not look away, and neither did the emergency investor stream, where thousands of board members, partners, and senior staff were watching the crisis unfold in real time. Richard took a step closer, his attention fully on Zaria now, and there was a faint smile on his face, the kind that did not invite but tested. "Maybe," he continued, his voice carrying just enough volume to be picked up clearly by the microphones. "We should let her try." A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the room, not loud, not overt, but present, the kind that seeks permission and finds it quickly when it comes from the top. "You know," he added, gesturing loosely toward the screens filled with failing systems, "maybe she'll have better luck than my Ivy League team." This time the laughter was a little more audible, though still careful, still contained within the boundaries of professionalism, but unmistakable in its direction. On the internal feed, private reactions and urgent messages began appearing from executives, partners, and board observers watching remotely. "Who is she?" One user wrote. "Is this part of the demo?" Another asked. "Security needs to step in," someone else added, followed by a comment that lingered longer than the rest. Not because it was louder, but because it reflected something quieter and more persistent. "She doesn't look like she belongs there." Zaria heard none of the comments directly, but she felt their weight in the room, in the way people looked at her, and then away, in the way her presence had shifted from invisible to intrusive, without her saying a single word. Denise moved slightly closer to her daughter, her hand brushing lightly against Zaria's arm, in a gesture that was both protective and uncertain, as if she were ready to guide her out of the room at the first sign of escalation. But Zaria did not move. She stood still, her gaze steady, not challenging but not retreating either, as if she were anchored by something deeper than the moment itself. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying her, and then, with a tone that balanced mockery and curiosity, he made it explicit. "I'll make it simple," he said. "If you can identify what my entire team has missed," he gestured again toward the failing displays, "I will personally recommend a $75 million recovery contract and scholarship fund in your name." The number hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, designed to provoke a reaction, to frame the situation as absurd before it could become serious. But Zaria's expression did not change. She took a small step forward, just enough to close the distance between herself and the nearest console. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and unexpectedly firm. "I don't need your money," she said, and the room seemed to lean in without realizing it. "I just need you to listen." The words landed differently than anything that had been said so far, not because they were louder, but because they did not fit the pattern the room had already decided on. And for a brief moment, the laughter faded, replaced by something quieter, something that felt almost like hesitation, as if the script had shifted in a way no one had prepared for. And as Richard's smile thinned slightly, his confidence still intact but no longer effortless, the question that no one had asked yet began to take shape beneath the surface of the moment, unspoken but impossible to ignore. What exactly did she see that they did not? For a moment, no one moved, as if Zaria's words had created a pause that the room did not quite know how to process. And then, almost imperceptibly, the usual rhythm of the engineers resumed, keyboards clicking, screens refreshing, conversations restarting in low, skeptical tones, because whatever she had said did not fit within the logic they trusted, and yet she remained where she was, standing just beside the nearest workstation, her eyes fixed on the main display, without reaching for the keyboard, without asking for permission again, as if she understood that the real problem was not something that could be solved by typing faster or thinking harder in the same direction. One of the senior engineers, a man who had spent years building systems like this, leaned back slightly in his chair and crossed his arms, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and doubt that he did not bother to hide. "You're saying it's not broken?" he asked, his tone neutral but edged with disbelief. And Zoria did not look at him when she answered. "I'm saying it's not failing the way you think it is," she replied quietly, her gaze still following the streams of data as they updated in real time, as if she were listening to something beneath the noise. Around her, the engineers continued their work, but their attention had shifted, some glancing at her between lines of code, others pausing just long enough to hear what she might say next, while Richard stood a few steps behind, his expression controlled again, though the ease from earlier had not fully returned. Zaria took a slow breath, then spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that carried across the room. "You're all trying to fix the hardest parts," she said, and now a few more heads turned toward her. But the mistake isn't there. She finally shifted her attention to one of the secondary panels, a section of the system that displayed the interface layer where commands were translated into actions, a place that looked almost too simple compared to the complexity surrounding it. "It's here," she added, pointing gently, not touching the screen, just indicating, and the engineer at that station frowned slightly, leaning forward to follow her gesture. "That's just the input handler," he said, dismissing it with a small shake of his head. "We've already checked that." Zaria nodded once, as if she had expected that answer. "You checked it for errors," she said, "but you didn't check if it's asking the right question." The phrasing hung in the air, unfamiliar, almost out of place, in a room that dealt in precision and certainty, and for a second, no one responded, not because they agreed, but because they were trying to translate what she meant into something that fit their framework. "That's not how this works," another engineer said, more firmly this time. Turning slightly in his chair, "The system executes commands based on defined logic. It doesn't get confused." Zaria met his gaze for the first time, and there was no challenge in her expression, only a quiet insistence. "Then why is it making decisions that don't match the data?" she asked. And the question was simple enough that it cut through the layers of explanation they had been building, leaving a gap that no one immediately filled. Richard exhaled slowly, then gestured toward the workstation she had been looking at. "If you have a point," he said, his tone measured but no longer dismissive, "make it." There was a brief hesitation, not from Zaria, but from the engineer seated at the console, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, as if unsure whether to yield control, even temporarily, to someone who had not earned it by any of the standards he recognized. But the silence around him grew heavier, and finally, with a reluctant motion, he leaned back and moved his chair just enough to give her space. Zaria stepped forward, her movements careful and deliberate, then pointed to the line she wanted tested while the senior engineer remained at the keyboard, creating a sandbox copy of the module so her theory could be verified without touching the live system. The senior engineer entered the change exactly where Zaria indicated, then ran the corrected module inside a sandbox simulation. And for a brief moment, nothing happened. The same red warnings pulsing on the live screens, while the test environment quietly recalculated the scenario that had failed again and again. "That's it," one engineer murmured under his breath, not loud enough to challenge her directly, but enough to be heard by those nearby. And Richard's gaze sharpened slightly, his posture straightening as he watched the screens, waiting, measuring, unwilling to react too soon, because reacting meant acknowledging the possibility that she might be right. 5 seconds passed, then 10, and the system continued to process, lines of data streaming across the displays in rapid succession, recalculating, reevaluating, as if it were being asked a question it had never fully understood before. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, one of the error messages disappeared. The engineer closest to that screen leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the output, his fingers instinctively moving toward the keyboard before stopping, because something was changing on its own. Another alert blinked out, then another, each one vanishing, not with drama, but with quiet finality, like a series of doors closing in the correct order for the first time in days, and a subtle shift moved through the room, not yet relief, but recognition that the pattern was breaking. "Wait," someone said, louder now, drawing attention to the main display, where the system status indicator flickered, hesitated, and then changed from red to yellow, a transitional state that had eluded them for nearly 3 days. And within seconds, the yellow stabilized and shifted again, this time to a steady, unmistakable green. The room fell completely silent, the kind of silence that follows not confusion but realization, as every screen began updating in sync, performance metrics recalculating in real time, graphs rising where they had been flat or falling, and a line of text appeared across the central display, confirming what no one had expected to see so quickly. System stable. Zaria stepped back slightly, not claiming the moment, not even looking at the others, as if she had simply done what needed to be done and nothing more, while behind her, the engineers stared at their monitors, some refreshing their screens, others running diagnostics, as if to confirm that what they were seeing was not a temporary anomaly. "Response time is up," one of them said, his voice tight with disbelief. 38% improvement in the test module. And another added, almost immediately, "The critical failure rate just dropped to near zero in the simulation." Richard did not speak at first, his eyes fixed on the main display, his expression unreadable as the reality settled in. Not just that the system was working, but that it had been restored by a change so small it bordered on invisible. A single line that had altered the way the system interpreted its instructions. "How did she do that?" one comment asked, followed by another. "They missed something that's simple." And then a third, more reflective. "Maybe it was never the AI." The thought lingered, not just in the chat, but in the room itself, because as the engineers traced back through the change Zaria had made, the implication became impossible to ignore. The system had not lacked intelligence. It had been built on the wrong assumption. And as that realization began to take shape, subtle but undeniable, the question that followed was far more unsettling than the problem they had just solved. If the mistake was not in the machine, then where had it really come from? The silence that followed the system's recovery did not last long. Because silence in a room like this was never empty. It was always filled with analysis, verification, and the quiet urgency of people trying to understand what had just happened before someone else explained it for them. And almost immediately, the engineers began retracing the change Zaria had made, not to challenge it anymore, but to dissect it, to understand how something so small had resolved something so large. And as they moved through the code, line by line, a pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once it was seen. "Hold on," one of the senior engineers said, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation, and he leaned closer to his screen, scrolling through a different section of the system, his expression tightening, not with confusion, but recognition. The kind that comes when you realize the problem is not isolated. "This isn't the only place," he added, louder now, drawing attention from across the room, and several others turned toward him, their own hands pausing mid-motion as he highlighted another line, then another, each one structured in the same way, each one carrying the same subtle flaw. A command issued where a condition should have been checked, an instruction assumed rather than verified. Zaria did not interrupt. She simply watched as they followed the trail themselves. As the realization spread from one screen to another, from one engineer to the next, like a ripple moving through still water until it reached the far end of the room. "There are dozens of these," someone said, and then another voice corrected quietly. "No, more than that." The count climbed quickly, not because they were searching for it, but because once they knew what to look for, it revealed itself everywhere, embedded in different modules, across different systems, all variations of the same underlying mistake, a consistent pattern of telling the system what to do, instead of asking it what it should do, based on the data it already had. "This can't be right," one engineer muttered, though his tone suggested that it was exactly right, and that was the problem, because the consistency of the error pointed to something deeper than oversight, something systemic. Richard took a step forward, his earlier composure returning in form if not in substance. As he looked over the engineer's shoulder at the highlighted code, his mind already moving through implications, possibilities, explanations, but none of them settled comfortably. "Run a full scan," he said, his voice steady, and the command was executed immediately. A system-wide analysis initiated to identify every instance of the pattern Zaria had described, and as the results populated the screens, the room grew quieter again, not with anticipation this time, but with a kind of dawning weight. Hundreds. The number appeared in a report window, then expanded as more modules were included. Not a handful of isolated errors, but a widespread issue that had been integrated into the very structure of their systems. This is across every product, using the same internal decision framework. The senior engineer said, his voice lower now, more controlled. Vehicle control, traffic prediction, and even the financial forecasting tools built from the same training templates. Another engineer opened a separate file, one that documented the internal training guidelines used for new developers, the standardized practices that ensured consistency across projects. And as he scrolled, his expression shifted in a way that drew immediate attention. "These patterns," he said slowly, "they match the training examples." A few people moved closer, looking over his shoulder, and there it was, not hidden, not obscure, but written clearly in the documentation. The same structure, the same logic, the same assumption, repeated as a model for how code should be written, as if the mistake had been taught rather than discovered. "Who approved this?" someone asked, the question not directed at anyone in particular, but hanging in the air with a new kind of gravity. And for a moment, no one answered, not because they did not know, but because they did. The document header displayed the approval chain, each name listed in order, each sign-off a layer of validation, and at the top, the final authorization. The one that carried the most weight, the one that made everything beneath it official, was Richard Halverson. The room did not react immediately, but something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, in the way people stood, in the way they looked at the screens, and then at him. Not with accusation, not yet, but with an awareness that had not been there before. And Richard, for the first time since the crisis had begun, did not move to fill the silence, as if he understood that any response now would not simply address a technical issue, but something far more fundamental. The silence that followed the revelation did not remain neutral for long, because silence in a room built on authority inevitably demanded to be filled. And Richard Halverson, who had spent his entire career controlling narratives before they could control him, straightened his posture and took a measured step forward, reclaiming the center of the room, not with volume, but with presence. His expression composed once again, though the effort behind that composure was no longer invisible. "So," he began, his voice calm, almost reflective, as if the situation had not just shifted beneath his feet. "We've identified a pattern." He paused briefly, letting the words settle, reframing the discovery as something manageable, something contained, and then his gaze moved to Zaria, sharper now, more deliberate. "That still doesn't mean you understand the system," he added, the tone subtle but unmistakably defensive, a recalibration of power rather than an admission of error. A few of the engineers glanced between them, sensing the shift from analysis to confrontation, while the livestream audience, still growing, leaned into the moment with renewed intensity, comments beginning to speculate not just about the technology, but about what would happen next. Zaria did not respond immediately, her expression steady, not confrontational, not deferential, as if she were waiting for him to finish rather than interrupting. And that patience seemed to unsettle him more than resistance would have. Richard let out a small breath, then made his move. "If what you're saying is true," he continued, his voice gaining a sharper edge, "then the problem isn't just one system, it's all of them." He gestured broadly toward the screens, toward the architecture of Helixara itself, the implication clear. The scale of the issue now expanded beyond a single fix into something that could not be resolved in minutes. "So let's test your insight," he said. And now the room stilled again, not with uncertainty but anticipation, because this was the moment where control would either be reinforced or lost. "You have 24 hours, he declared, his tone firm, leaving no space for negotiation, to identify every instance of this error across our infrastructure while my engineers verify and apply the corrections. If you succeed," he added, after a brief pause, You get the $75 million. The number returned, no longer a joke, but a stake, a symbol of what he was willing to risk to reclaim authority. And if you don't, his gaze held hers now, steady and unyielding. This ends here, and neither you nor your mother will be permitted back on this executive floor again. Denise shifted slightly behind her daughter, her hand tightening around the edge of her cleaning cart, but she did not speak, as if she understood that this moment did not belong to her. Around the room, reactions varied, some engineers exchanging uneasy glances, others looking down at their screens as if avoiding involvement, because the challenge was not just technical, it was symbolic, a line being drawn between who belonged and who did not. The internal investor feed erupted with reactions. Speculation rose rapidly, some voices doubting, others defending. The question spread faster than any answer could contain it. Could someone with no formal position, no credentials, no access accomplish in a single day what an entire corporation had failed to resolve in 3? Zaria looked at Richard for a long second, not intimidated, not defiant, but thoughtful, as if she were weighing something far beyond the terms he had set. And then she nodded once, a small, controlled movement that carried more certainty than any declaration. "Okay," she said simply, her voice quiet but clear, and with that single word, the clock began, not marked by a sound, but by the collective awareness of everyone in the room, the systems around them suddenly feeling larger, heavier, more complex, as if they had just expanded in response to the challenge. While Zaria moved back toward the console, her focus already shifting from the moment to the work ahead, somewhere beneath the tension, beneath the doubt, beneath the unspoken expectations, pressing in from every direction. One question began to take hold, stronger now, sharper, impossible to ignore, not just whether she could do it, but what it would mean for everyone else if she did. By the 12th hour, the room felt stretched thin. The glow of monitors had replaced natural light, typing had slowed, and Zaria remained at the console, exhausted but still focused. The system reports continued to update, numbers improving, errors dropping, but the progress was no longer enough to silence the doubt that had begun to resurface, not loudly, not openly, but in the subtle shifts of tone and posture around her, in the way some engineers now watched with arms crossed instead of leaning in, in the way conversations resumed at a lower volume, no longer centered on her insights, but on contingency plans, as if preparing for the possibility that this would not end the way it had begun. Richard stood near the far side of the room, his presence steady, his expression composed, but his eyes never strayed far from Zaria, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the room with a controlled firmness that cut through the lingering silence. "You're guiding corrections to systems that affect real people," he said, not as a question but as a reminder. His words measured and deliberate, and if your logic is wrong, the consequences won't stay inside this room. The statement was not raised, not aggressive, but it landed with a weight that shifted the atmosphere, reframing her work, not as progress but as risk. And for the first time since she had started, Zaria's hands paused above the keyboard, her focus momentarily breaking as the implication settled in, not because she had not considered it, but because hearing it spoken aloud made it harder to ignore. Across the internal investor feed, the tone had changed as well. The earlier excitement giving way to uncertainty. Messages questioning the pace, the safety, and the judgment of letting someone so young and unproven guide corrections to systems that extended far beyond the room, while the support that had surged earlier fractured into competing voices, some still believing, others pulling back, waiting for proof that might not come in time. Denise stood a few steps behind her daughter, watching quietly, her hands folded tightly together as if holding to something fragile, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, cutting through the noise in a way that only familiarity could. "Zaria," she said, and her daughter turned slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. "You don't have to prove anything to them." The words were simple, but they carried years of being overlooked, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade. Her gaze dropped briefly to the screen. The code no longer as clear as it had been hours before, the patterns harder to hold in her mind as exhaustion crept in, not dramatic but persistent, dulling the sharpness that had guided her so far, and for the first time, doubt did not come from outside. It rose from within, quiet but undeniable. A question that did not demand an answer, but lingered just long enough to disrupt her certainty. What if she missed something? What if one line, one assumption, one overlooked detail changed everything? And as her fingers hovered once more above the keys, no longer moving with the same unbroken confidence, the room seemed to lean back slightly, as if waiting not for her next move, but for the moment she might finally hesitate. Zuria's fingers remained suspended for a moment longer, caught between hesitation and instinct, as the quiet weight of doubt pressed against her concentration. But instead of forcing herself forward in the same direction, she shifted her approach, drawing a slow breath and letting her eyes move differently across the screen, not searching for errors in the same pattern she had been correcting for hours, but stepping back mentally, tracing the flow of data rather than the structure of commands. And in that subtle shift, something unexpected began to surface. The system logs, now cleaner after her earlier fixes, revealed pathways that had previously been obscured by noise. And as she followed one of those pathways, her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for the engineer standing closest to notice the slight narrowing of her eyes, the way her focus sharpened rather than faded. "What is this?" she murmured, almost to herself, and she leaned closer to the screen, scrolling through a sequence of data transfers that did not align with the system's intended operations. Small enough to avoid immediate detection, but consistent, repeating at intervals that suggested intention rather than randomness. "That's just background traffic," one engineer said automatically, his tone reflexive, shaped by familiarity with the system. But Zuria shook her head slightly, her attention still fixed on the anomaly. "No," she said quietly, "it's not." She traced the timestamps, her mind aligning the sequence with the broader system behavior. And then she opened a deeper layer of logs, one that had not been fully accessible before the system stabilized. And what she saw there caused her to pause completely, her hand resting on the edge of the console as if grounding herself in the moment. "How long has this been running?" she asked, her voice steady but lower now, carrying a different kind of weight. And the question drew immediate attention. The senior engineer stepped closer, pulling up the same data on his screen, his fingers moving quickly as he cross-referenced the timestamps, his expression tightening with each passing second. 17 months, he said finally, the words coming out more quietly than he intended. And the room reacted not with noise but with a shift in posture, a collective leaning forward as the implication settled in. "That's not possible," someone else said, though the certainty in his voice was already weakening. Zuria continued, following the data stream to its endpoint, and then back again, mapping its path through the system. And what she found was not a single breach but a pattern, a series of small, deliberate extractions hidden within normal operations, disguised as legitimate processes, but fundamentally misaligned with the system's purpose. "It's leaking data," she said, and now the room was fully silent again, the kind of silence that comes when a problem changes category entirely, when it stops being a technical failure and becomes something else. "Not just small amounts," she added, her voice still controlled. "Large-scale, structured extraction." Richard stepped forward, his earlier composure returning in form if not in stability, his gaze fixed on the screen. "External intrusion?" he asked, the question immediate, almost reflexive, because it offered a direction, a narrative that could be managed. But Zuria did not answer right away. Instead, she opened another layer of code, one that defined the logic behind the data routing. And as she traced the structure, the connection became clear, not through speculation, but through alignment. The same pattern she had been correcting throughout the system now appearing here, embedded in the pathways that allowed the data to move unnoticed. "No," she said finally, and this time she looked at him directly, her expression steady, almost gentle in its clarity. "It's not external." The word settled heavily, and she turned back to the screen, highlighting a section of code that mirrored the earlier errors. The same confusion between instruction and verification, the same assumption built into the logic. "These errors," she continued, "they didn't just break the system, they opened it." The realization moved through the room slowly, but inevitably, as engineers began checking their own sections, confirming what she had identified. Each validation, adding weight to the conclusion that could no longer be avoided. The system had not been breached from the outside. It had been exposed from within, its own flawed logic, creating pathways that allowed data to be accessed and removed without triggering alarms because the system did not recognize the behavior as wrong. When we fixed the commands, Zaria said, her voice quieter now, we removed the confusion that was hiding it. The implication expanded beyond the room, beyond the company, into something that carried legal, financial, and ethical consequences. And as the magnitude of the discovery settled in, the stakes shifted again, rising sharply, no longer confined to performance metrics or system stability, but reaching into the realm of accountability and intent. And as the engineers continued to uncover the extent of the breach, one question began to press forward, heavier than all the others. If the system had been exposing itself for 17 months, then who had been watching? When the truth surfaced, the room tightened. Federal authorities were notified within minutes, because the data on the screens was no longer just a malfunction, it was evidence. Within the hour, Helixar's legal team connected with a federal cybercrime liaison by secure call, and later that evening, agents arrived on site, shifting the atmosphere from internal urgency to formal investigation as their questions focused on the same logs Zaria had uncovered. Richard Halverson stood near the center of the room, his posture still upright, his expressions controlled. But the subtle tension in his jaw and the slight delay before each response revealed the strain beneath the surface, and when he finally spoke, addressing both the agents and the executives, still watching remotely. His voice carried a familiar steadiness, one that had guided countless presentations and negotiations before. It appears. He began carefully, choosing each word with deliberate precision, that someone may have exploited our systems from the outside. The explanation was logical, almost expected, a narrative that aligned with industry precedent, and for a brief moment, it seemed to settle over the room as a possible truth, something that could be investigated, contained, perhaps even resolved without dismantling the foundation beneath it. But Zaria, who had remained near the console, her focus still anchored in the data rather than the conversation, lifted her head slightly, and when she spoke, her voice did not interrupt so much as redirect. If it's external, she said quietly, and the room turned toward her again, then why does the code follow the exact internal framework your company approved? The question was simple, but it carried a weight that shifted the narrative instantly, and before Richard could respond, she moved her hand across the screen, pulling up comparative logs, aligning segments of code side by side, highlighting patterns that were too consistent to dismiss. The timestamps match your internal development cycles, she continued, her tone steady, not accusatory but clear. The structure follows your training models, and the naming conventions are identical to your internal standards. One of the agents stepped closer, examining the data with a trained eye, and then nodded slightly, confirming what the evidence already suggested. This doesn't look like an external breach, he said, his voice measured. This looks like a systemic vulnerability embedded during development. The words settled heavily, not just because of their implication, but because of their finality. And for the first time, Richard did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the screen as if searching for an alternative explanation that would not come. Around him, the room had changed. The subtle deference that had once defined his presence now replaced by a quiet distance, as if the authority he carried had been recalibrated by the truth itself. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, and then, with a slow exhale, Richard straightened, not to reclaim control, but to acknowledge its absence. He turned toward Zaria, his expression no longer guarded but reflective. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight, one shaped not by confidence but by recognition. I underestimated what you saw, he said, the words careful but heavy, and they moved through the room with more impact than any technical explanation that had come before. He continued, addressing not just her, but everyone present, and those still watching from beyond the room. I underestimated you, and I overlooked what mattered most. The admission did not erase what had happened, but it marked a shift, a moment where accountability replaced deflection. He gestured briefly to his assistant, who stepped forward with a prepared document, the financial commitment already in motion. The $75 million commitment will be honored through the board and legal process, he said, not as a challenge now, but as a public obligation. And yet Zaria did not react the way the room expected. She looked at him for a moment, then shook her head slightly, her voice calm, grounded in something deeper than the transaction being offered. This was never about the money, she said, and the simplicity of the statement carried a clarity that cut through everything else. She glanced briefly toward her mother, who stood quietly behind her, and then back at the room. The problem is that you built systems that don't see people like me, she continued, her tone steady, not confrontational but honest. And when you don't see us, you miss things that matter. The words lingered, not as criticism alone, but as a reflection of something larger, something that extended beyond code and into the assumptions that shaped it. The cameras kept streaming, capturing Denise standing quietly at the edge of the room, no longer invisible. The facial recognition scanner outside the door remained unchanged, still running on the same foundation that had denied Zaria at the beginning. But now its failure meant something larger. The system had not recognized her because it had been built by people who had never truly learned to see her. If Zaria's courage made you think twice about who gets overlooked, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest and where you're watching from.